All right, so I want to welcome you, and we're going to have a little eye candy here. So I hope you have big screens that you're watching. And I want to start my presentation by, first of all, thanking one of the participants, and that's Amanda, who works with me here in the curatorial department. She set up these gowns, did a beautiful job, and I'll have a little bit of a surprise at the end because you're going to, well, I'll talk about it later. So let's get this thing started here. And I've got it multiple times. Hang on a minute, everybody. How do I zip through this? Here we go. Here we go. Okay. So when it comes to women's fashions that we're talking about, the changing silhouette is strictly during the time of Queen Victoria. And here we have pictured the young queen after her coronation in 1837. So her reign was quite long, and it lasted from 1837 to 1901. And then after the 1901 starts what they call the Edwardian period, and maybe you've heard of that. And fashions take a whole different look after that time period. So we're just going to focus on her reign. And you're thinking, okay, so what? We're Americans. Why is this important to have Queen Victoria involved? Because during that reign, it was so long, things that were happening in England were happening here as well, too. And for one was the invention and the mass production of the sewing machine. So this happened in Europe and here at the same time in this country in 1846. Well, the sewing machine, even though it was perfected at that time period, because it was in development for quite a while, it took a while for clothing to be mass produced. People did not go to the stores like we do today to buy what they wanted to wear. Prior to the sewing machine, everything was hand stitched. So you probably didn't have too many garments in your closet at that time. But now with the sewing machine, things could be somewhat mass produced. Again, they might do the actual dress, but it was fitted to you with a seamstress or by someone in your family who could sew. So the sewing machine did a lot of the work, but not all of the work, and that was important. Synthetic dyes were also being invented during Queen Victoria's reign. Prior to that, they were natural dyes, things that came from plants mainly. Or as an example of something much worse is the color green was produced with arsenic and copper. So they would use these two volatile, well, one, the arsenic was quite a volatile kind of chemical to get the color green in your garment. Well, here you're wearing this green dress, and it made a lot of people very sick. The textile industry then, as now, is sort of, I would call it a dirty industry. When you're using the dyes, let's say you're making green dresses back then, you were getting sick. And people still get sick today if you follow somehow the fashions are made today. These are in poorer countries. They're very polluting, the chemicals that are used, because now we're all synthetic dyes. So the textile industry is not the cleanest business to be involved in. But prior to the synthetic, it was all natural, so you had a limited choice of colors. Next, fashion magazines were becoming popular during Queen Victoria's reign. And I give some examples of the fashion magazines during my presentation. A couple of them, you may have heard of Godey's Ladies Book, was a very popular one in this country. And I'll show you some examples of that when we get later on. And then another invention, you might call, is printed fabric. And today we take printed fabrics for granted. But back then, this was a huge deal because you could be wearing a dress with a design on it. And if it got dirty, you might not notice it as much because it's printed. So that was a big deal back then. Of course, they washed their clothes then like we do today, not as much as we do. Hygiene was a little bit different back then. but people still like to be clean or look decently, maybe more so than people today, but we won't make any commentaries on that. So we're just going to focus on this time period in this country, and these are the things that help change. And when we get it, well, we'll talk about the fashion magazines later. So here we go with the magazines. On your left, you see Peterson's Ladies National Magazine, and this one is from 1871. These are both in our collection, these magazines, and Godey's Ladies Book. If you haven't seen them in person, they are fabulous books. They had stories, poetry, recipes. So they give a real great snapshot of what people were thinking about or what women were thinking about back then. They would have crafts, embroidery designs, or knitting patterns in them. The picture that I have on the upper right with the ladies, that is from the Godey's magazine that I have here on my desk. And going, wow, you know, pretty colors. Those colors were all hand watercolored. They could only print in black and white back in the 1800s. So they would print these fashion plates so that the ladies could see what the latest styles were. And then someone would painstakingly watercolor in, paint these pictures. That being said, the picture below is my office. And you can see I have a framed picture here with my desk, and that is from my personal collection at home from Peterson's. So what people do, like me, is you get your hands on these magazines and you just take out the plate and you have them framed beautifully, and you've got this gorgeous work of art. So that is a huge deal with the magazines, and these were increasingly popular. Printing was getting cheaper during Queen Victoria's reign. The magazines were becoming more prolific, and women were buying them and reading them and using them for inspiration. Yeah, I want to have the latest fashion, so let's see what the magazine says, and I'm going to have my dress made like what's pictured. So big deal back in the 1800s. Now, this garment is ubiquitous through the whole of the Queen Victoria's reign. You had, and if you can't identify that, it's called a corset. So the whole time women wore these. Now, this was an undergarment, not an outer garment like you might see some today, that would sort of keep everything together. You wanted to have this wonderful small waist, and then your hips could flare out below that. Now, during the course of the time period, the corset would change in size. Sometimes it was shorter, and then it would elongate. It would get longer, and it would cover the hips by the time the end of the Victorian period. But this example here is more of your 1860s corset. And these were worn, again, to make the waist smaller. And oftentimes we hear these stories about how unhealthy they were, because you were actually pulling in your organs on the inside of your body. I've read different accounts of this, where I've seen pictures of the organs distorted inside some of women's bodies by the corset. I have read stories about, no, not necessarily. They would not wear them super tight. I hope many of you have seen the movie Gone with the Wind, one of my favorites. But in it, Scarlett, the lead, and this is prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, has someone pulling on these strings to get her waist down. I'm sure that happened, but it was not, because you had to still survive. You still had to breathe. You still had to eat. So I'm not sure if they were tightened or not tightened, but again, you wanted that small waist, so I'm sure they were. They would start corseting girls, from what I've read, at the age of 10. And as you got older, you would be corseted more and more. Now, Would the average woman wear a corset all the time? Let's say the working woman. Would she? No, because you can't bend over that well in these. So when we're talking about Victorian fashions and the changing silhouette, even though the corset was something that you wore, this would be your upper middle class, which was starting to happen with industrialization, to upper class women. The poor women, no. They would be wearing a dress, but it was less fitted, let's just say that. And so they would not necessarily, well, they would not wear a corset because you cannot work in these things, even though it was the shaper. And the corset is something that you're going to see through all of these dresses that I'll be showing you. Another thing about children's clothing, I wanted to get into children's clothing because when you think women, you think children, especially during the 1800s. And what I'm showing you here are two dresses from our collection. The dress on the left is a grown woman's dress. The dress on the right is a child's dress, a girl's dress. They're very, very similar. And that's how people dressed children. That children during the 1800s, in particular more towards the beginning, were seen as miniature adults. They were not seen as we see them today. So they would dress them as miniature adults. And yes, boys would wear dresses in the early part of the Victorian era. And because let's face it, if you're potty training a boy or you're potty training a girl, a dress is going to be so much easier to handle than the pants. So children were seen as different kinds of people, but that evolved over time. So I just wanted to throw this in to show you that. And this dress that you're seeing here on the left is more of an early 1900s dress, but it was a good example of what we could find with children's and women's clothing. Okay, let's start with our first silhouette during Queen Victoria. On the left is the silhouette. And then the two dresses, this is the same dress, actually, two different snapshots of the 1840s gown. So the 1840s, excuse me, is mainly shown by the sloping shoulders, as you see, the V in the front. It was the style at the time. And at this time period, the poofiness of the skirt came from petticoats, strictly petticoats. So under this particular dress, I think Amanda put two petticoats under her. She would be wearing a corset and other undergarments. There are multiple layers that go on underneath, and I didn't get into that so much because they didn't necessarily define the silhouette of the wearer. But this particular gown is in our collection. It is stunning. The color is great. I could not say, I think it's been altered a little bit over the time, but this is something, you know, that would signify definitely 1840s. So we go from the 40s to, the petticoats a little bit. Petticoats were something that women wore from, good grief, 1700s all the way through the Victorian era. And eventually the word changed in the 20th century from petticoat to a slip. So this is the same kind of thing. The petticoat that you see on the left belonged to Mrs. Charles Strong. And if you're not familiar with the name, perhaps you've gone by the Strong Mansion, which is now Gannon's Old Main. This was her petticoat, one of hers that we have in our collection, which is gorgeous. She lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So that's hers. The one in the center is a child's petticoat. And we have several because, of course, if you're wearing a dress, you're going to have those layers underneath, a child or an adult. And the one on the right is a red petticoat. And again, going back to Gone with the Wind, if you've seen that movie, and there's Mammy got a red petticoat from Rhett Butler, but not just her. Other people wore red petticoats as well. And this one is a heavy fabric. Now, we all live in Erie. We know it gets cold in Erie. You would wear heavier petticoats in the wintertime, lighter petticoats in the summertime. So not only do we have this beautiful red petticoat, we've got petticoats that are made of flannel. We've got them made out of wool. We have insulated kind of petticoats. So you would wear what's appropriate for the weather, just like we do today. 1850s. Things change a little bit in the 1850s. And as you can see in the silhouette, now the skirt is getting a little bit bigger. This dress is spectacular. Take note of the printed fabric. Again, if it got dirty, you wouldn't notice it as much. Not only that, is if the sewing was a little not quite perfect on this dress, you wouldn't notice that either, because you would have this design that would take your eye instead. This dress, Amanda, I'm pretty sure you put 6 petticoats under this dress. Again, she did. You would only have petticoats in this time period. And we put 6, and it's still not quite as puffy as the silhouette, but did our best with this. And what signifies the 1850s are these ruffles that you've got. So they're trying to get bigger and bigger with the gown. Again, she would be wearing the corset. And this is a little off the shoulder number, not a winter dress as we know here in Erie, but a spectacular dress, and it has really aged very, very well. Okay, back to Godey's. This is a print that I found framed, and there's no date on this. For whatever reason, when it got framed, that part got covered. But by looking at this and now knowing the silhouette, all of you watching this know that these women are dressed in the 1850s. And so I just love these Godey's prints. I mean, they're just spectacular. And what I like about, again, the woman on the right, as you can see, is wearing a black dress. Now, black has changed a little bit over time. Today, if we're out and about for something fancy, we'll wear that little black dress, whatever we define as that. In the Victorian era, the black dress was strictly a dress of mourning. So someone in your family died, and you would wear the black dress for a year. They had a very strict way of mourning. Now, Queen Victoria, after her husband, Prince Albert, died, dressed in black the rest of her life. Most women would not do that. They would wear the black for a year, then they would go on to a gray or dark purple, and then go back to their normal attire. So this woman in right is pictured in mourning, and the others are not. Good for them. Okay, now in the late 1850s, the new invention was the hoops. So this is something that's designed, and these are all pictured here from our collection. They came in different sizes and shapes depending on the era of the gown. The hoop on the left, you can see it's sort of like a funky kind of shape. That would be a later hoop or crinoline. And they have different names for these. We call them hoops today, or a cage, but they would call them crinolines. Crinolines were made out of horsehair initially, and then it changed into this kind of concept with these steel hoops that were sewn together. And we've got many, and again, they changed because if you notice the hoops on the right picture, there's like this extra kinds of fabric on top. It looks like there's some kind of cage, and that was for the design that came a little bit later in the 1800s that we'll talk about, which is the bustle. So right now in the late 1850s, 1860s, we're dealing with just the hoops. And here we've got our silhouette. We have this gorgeous gown in our collection. This was donated by Mrs. Barron. who also donated land for something called Barron College, part of the Penn State system. She donated the dress. I don't know any story about the dress, and that's the sad thing. We have a lot of beautiful gowns in the collection, but we don't have the background story as to who wore them. Why do we have them? But Mrs. Barron donated this gown, and we did put hoops under it. Amanda did, and it really gave a nice shape. Again, that bell kind of shape. And this is defined as the 1860s. So this is your Civil War era, mid 1860s gown. Towards the end of the 1860s, they moved away from just the bell shape to now, well, I'll tell you what happened. These dresses were getting so big that people couldn't get through doors, from what I've read. I mean, they were just so big. So instead, they thought, well, we'll be a little more practical and take some of this size, and instead of going out left and right, we're going to go back with the size of the dress. And that's what they've done. So here we go with the goatees again. Again, all of you with your education now can look at those women and go, oh yeah, 1860s. Because now you can define the silhouette and the shape. Again, beautifully hand watercolored plate, fashion plate. And that little girl that's pictured there looks sort of like her mother's dress, or one of the women's dresses. It was just shorter. And as a little girl aged, her dress got longer. Okay, I wanted to bring in shawls into this picture. Because when you're wearing a dress that's so big, you just can't put a coat on necessarily over these dresses. So the women would wear shawls. And the shawls came in all kinds of beautiful colors. The shawl on the left here was an Irish wedding shawl. We do have it on exhibit right now. And we do have the story of this Irish woman who bought this. And I think the shawl cost $100 back in the 1800s. I mean, a huge amount of money. The shawl on the left is a gorgeous black lace shawl. So shawls were enormously popular. The most popular ones were from India, because they would use the wool like a pashima, like we have today. So they'd be wool, they'd be brightly colored and printed, and you would always cover up in a shawl when you went outside. Again, the Victorians were very modest, and you always covered. You always had a hat on, and you always covered yourself up. None of this bare skin, unless it was an evening event and it was indoors, and you could take off your shawl then. But then you would wear long gloves quite often. I mean, there are all kinds of sets of rules on the proper way to do things and the improper way to do things. But I wanted to showcase a couple of these beautiful shawls. 1870s. This dress comes in 3 parts. So we've got, again, the movement of the bulk of the dress to the back. So she has the bodice, which is the top part. Again, she's corseted, a little bit longer. She has her skirt, and then she has an outer skirt. And you would wear all the undergarments underneath both skirts. And so you would have your hoops still, and you would have a bustle. And the bustle changed. It was made out of different things. We've got bustles that is made of metal. And so you would tie this on and have this metal contraption, you know, where the top of your derriere is. We've got bustles. There's some that were made of horsehair. So you would have a cotton bag filled with the horsehair that you would wear behind you. We've got them that had cotton. It was just sort of a pad that you would tie on and wear. So the bustle evolved. So the bustle during time would go down lower, and then it would grow out higher. But the 1870s was a great period. I mean, this woman, high class woman, very wealthy woman who owned this dress, and it is in gorgeous, gorgeous shape. Okay, a little bit about wedding dresses. Again, this is off the silhouette, but this wedding dress that you're seeing here, and yes, it is a wedding dress, um, we have in our collection. The fabric is from the 1700s. It was remade in the 1800s, and the dress was originally Mrs. Oliver Hazard Perry's gown. Now, I don't know who it belonged to when it came to us right now, or if they wore it. I'd have to do a little more research on this. But wedding dresses, as you can see, were not necessarily white, like we consider wedding dresses today. The white wedding dress came in popularity due to Queen Victoria. She wore a white wedding dress, and if it was good enough for her, a lot of people did that after her. Everybody? No, not necessarily. Oftentimes, when a woman got married, depending on her means or not, on what she liked, she would wear the best dress she had, or she would buy a dress in a color that she felt she wanted to wear. So the white dress is a newer concept, but this one here that we have in our collection is beautiful. And to be married in that would be just as good as a white dress. So Victoria, not only did she dictate shape of gowns or how the shape, but the colors and some of the way that people acted back then. Moving on to the 1880s, this gown, fabulous, fabulous, fabulous dress. We have a lot going on with this dress. It's a little bit, some would say, over the top, which is okay. The bustle at that point, again, she's corseted. You would have a more slender shape in the front of the dress. So things were really tighter at this end, but not close, but a little bit wider than your hips is what the dress would come out to. And then she would be bustled in the back. And this particular dress has a train. Not all the dresses did back then in this time period. But I read something so funny because there was some women who were bustling, and they said you weren't bustled enough unless you could rest a teacup on your rear end, so to speak, because of all the bustle. This dress is not bustled as much, but again, a spectacular gown and signifies the era. Now, as we're getting towards the end of the Victorian era, women are gaining more rights. They're doing more things. And sportswear is becoming a thing that never happened before. If you wanted to participate in sports as a woman in the mid to early Victorian era, you wore whatever you had. Now things are becoming a little more practical. And sportswear is leaning, they're trying to take the practicality of men a little bit, of their clothes. So this, but not totally. So the blue and white stripe that you're seeing is, believe it or not, a tennis skirt. Women started playing tennis in the late 1800s. This skirt came down almost to the ground. And I play tennis, so I'm not sure how I would manage in that dress, but that's what they wore. And she would wear a blouse with that, of course. This coat in the middle was for automobile riding. So again, we're talking early 1900s, at the very end of the Victorian era. Automobiles are now a thing, and you wanted to keep and they were open at that point. So you wanted to keep the dust and the dirt off of this dress that you're wearing. So that this is a linen coat, and you would wear this light coat over your dress. And the goggles, I think we even have some goggles in our collection that they would wear. And then on the right, if you don't recognize this as a bathing suit, it is. So you would wear this garment along with your long stockings, and you would go swimming, because doctors in the late 1800s realized that swimming could be a healthy thing. So give it a try. Again, it was very modest. You would not necessarily bathe with a bunch of people like we do today, men and women and children. especially Queen Victoria, and in England, very proper, they would have a little a wooden structure that they would push out into the water, and she could slide into the ocean or the lake or wherever she was in modesty. No one would see you, and then you would come back into the structure. They would pull that out so no one could see a wet lady. But we do have several. I think we even have a wool, strangely enough, bathing suit. And again, this is very late Victorian, probably more Edwardian, but women were doing more things. Heck, just last year we celebrated the 100 years of women's rights to vote. So again, more rights are being given to women. More women are actually now starting to work out of the home for the first time in the late Victorian era, especially with all the factories that are happening in the industrialization. So women have become more practical in their clothing, and hence sportswear was invented for women. This gorgeous piece that Amanda found in the center is your 1890s. So you can see we've got a slimming down of the silhouette. The bustle has disappeared at this point. And we didn't get a side shot of it. We've got the high collar, and we have this sort of a, how do I call it, a unibosom kind of thing going on, but it would become bigger. It was more of an S shape, a little bit more of an S. This is not, if you look at the silhouette and you've got the lady's face, and then if you look where her bosom is and then to her rear end, you can envision a little bit of an S happening here. So the silhouette is changing more. And I did want to show you on the right is another lace 1890s gown that we have in the collection. Again, still corseted, still petticoats, not the hoops anymore, but we're still wearing multiple layers underneath to give this shape. We want to keep that small waist defined every decade through this era. And in 1900, and Queen Victoria's reign ended in 1901 with her death. Now in 1900, you can see how slim the silhouette was becoming. Really slim. Again, taking their impetus from menswear. So you've got this woman golfing here, and the dress on the right is still spectacular gowns, but a lot slimmer in shape. They're starting to lose a lot of that bulk underneath. And it was just becoming more freer for women to do more of the things that they were able to do as time progressed. And I think that's it.